"Sir, can you buy my doll? Mom hasn't eaten in 3 days." The words arrived on the bell of the bakery like a tiny, urgent chime. Augusto had his hand on the door, the steam of fresh bread in his face, the late-morning city folding itself into routine around him, a cyclist weaving between parked cars, a woman with a stroller arguing softly into a phone, the espresso machine sighing behind the counter. For a moment, the world narrowed to a single, unexpected voice, small, breathless, imploring. He looked down. A 6-year-old girl stood there, knees dusty, clutching a doll whose dress was more thread than fabric. Its hair was a tangle of yarn, one eye a missing button. Pulled tight in the child's other hand was a crumpled slip of paper, like a little desperate banner. Her sandals were too big. Her eyes were steady. The plea was not theatrical. It was as matter-of-fact as the weight of the note. Augusto was the kind of man who noticed details others missed. His suit had the slow sheen of careful living. His watch caught the sun as he shifted his weight. He had come into the neighborhood to buy bread for a client meeting, to keep the punctual arc of his day intact. The world he inhabited ran on schedules and tidy margins. This street, this bakery, should have been a brief footnote on his morning. Instead, the child's small voice rearranged the room. He could have offered the usual, a quarter of his attention and a word of dismissal. People did. The bakery's corner table was dotted with faces that looked away. The barista wiped a counter as though smoothing over the interruption. But Augusto hesitated. For a heartbeat, his mind registered all the practicalities, the contract waiting in his inbox, the boardroom lights, the taxi pumps outside. And then an image slid into that tidy architecture. The ragged doll, the child's folded hands, the way she seemed older than her years. He took his wallet out without thinking of numbers. The bill he handed the girl was larger than she expected. It was a soft rectangle, crisp enough to rustle with authority. He did not count change. He did not ask the price. He simply put the money into her palm and watched the very adult exchange of currency pass to a child whose world had been reduced to an object she was willing to sell. The girl's face, Anna Clara, became a map of motion. She clutched the paper, looked at him for a second that felt like a small, solemn benediction, and bolted. Her feet were quick, a staccato across the sidewalk. She disappeared down an alley flanked by stacked crates of oranges and the smell of frying oil. Augusto stood with the door open, the bakery's warmth pressing at his back, and felt something rearrange in his chest. He slipped the doll into his briefcase without conscious deliberation, folding its limbs into the pocket where pens lived and receipts were kept. It had a smell, old fabric and something faintly sweet, like a childhood that had been washed and rewashed. That smell carried into the rest of his day, so that as his car threaded the city, the sound of tires on asphalt was layered over by an unlikely ache. He found himself thinking of the small, efficient decisions that ran his life, and how this one interruption had no place on any spreadsheet. Across a few blocks and down a thin flight of stairs, Ana Clara ran home. Elena, her mother, opened the door slowly at first, then with the wary relief of someone who always checks the hinges. The bill's number did what numbers do. It bought a sack of rice, a strip of fresh vegetables, a bit of chicken and milk. The kitchen light, which had been a single dim bulb, suddenly seemed to have more to hold. Elena did not let the moment become a claim on pity. She wrapped the food into plastic bags with the same careful motions she used for the child's hair. Pride softened but did not dissolve. She would not let them be reduced to mere recipients. She turned the money into movement, something practical. For Augusto, the doll in his briefcase was an intrusion. At a meeting, the day took its shape around numbers and deadlines. Yet every time his hand brushed the leather, the ragged fabric nudged the edge of his attention. At noon, as suits and contracts folded into lunch, he opened the briefcase on autopilot, and the doll presided in the corner like a tiny witness. He imagined the child's small apartment, if one could call it that, a kitchenette with the radio murmuring, the sound of a neighbor's television bleeding through paper-thin walls, a mother who measured every grain. He should have been content with the immediate relief the bill had brought. He should have let the child's problem remain just that, alleviated for now. Instead, a new disquiet arrived, polite yet persistent. He kept thinking about the way the girl had not asked for food. She had offered the doll, a prized object exchanged for survival. That image lodged. How often, he wondered, did people trade pieces of themselves simply to keep going? What did it mean when a child made such a barter? Have you ever passed a moment like that, where the world rearranges itself around an ordinary object? If this moved you, like the video and subscribe for more stories like this. The rest of the day unfolded like someone else's script.
Augusto went back to the office, opened files, smiled with the timing of someone who had trained the muscles of sociality. Yet the doll lay in his briefcase like an unread message. That night, back in his apartment with its glass windows and the city lights, he took the doll out and set it on the table. He propped it against a stack of letters he did not remember receiving. The doll's missing buttons seemed now like an accusation. He did not sleep well.
Small things lodged in his mind. The way Ana Clara's voice had not quavered. The tilt of Helena's shoulders when she took the groceries. The timely, economized homemaking that made the food spread itself out as if it had been a feast. In the morning, he found himself at the bakery again, not because bread was missing from his life, but because he felt obliged to reconstruct the thread of the day before. The bakery smelled of yeast and sugar, of coffee grounds being tamped and butter warming. The barista glanced at him. The same patrons watched the man who had paid more attention than they had. "She left after you did," the barista said, nodding toward the alley. "Runs home quick. She's got a mom nearby." Augusto asked questions that felt both untimely and necessary. He asked about addresses and directions, about schools, and whether the child sold things regularly. He learned that the neighborhood was stitched with people who kept their distance and those who leaned in with small services. Someone who fixed shoes 2 doors down, a woman who babysat for a few hours a week. He was told, by careful, practiced mouths, that the family lived in one of the narrow buildings squeezed between a laundromat and a shuttered storefront. The method of the telling had the soft certainty of people who had seen hardship but would not be defined by it. He walked the streets he rarely visited. They were the kind of streets that had names but no fame, where life was a sequence of practical acts, carrying water, mounting a ladder to fix a light, balancing a child on a hip while a neighbor offered a chore. The buildings were close, their stairwells narrow. On the 3rd floor of a block that smelled faintly of fried garlic, he found a door with a child's drawing taped to the inside. Someone had sketched a sun with crooked rays. He knocked and waited. The door opened a crack. A pair of cautious eyes peered out. Helena. She did not smile. She did not invite him in. Her posture was guarded, like someone who knows how to protect a child against both blunt harm and the more ambiguous patronizing that comes wrapped as pity. "Can I help you?" she asked, voice practical. He told a compact truth, that he had bought a doll from her daughter, that the doll had an odd effect on him. He offered no sermon. He offered no one-off promises. For a man who wielded meat sentences in boardrooms, he chose a strangely simple language. "I wanted to make sure you were all right." Helena's silence lasted long enough for a neighbor to cough. It was not a silence of wounded pride alone. It was a silence calibrated with a lifetime of guarding self-respect. She looked at the briefcase at his side, at his tie, then at the vague folds of his hand. "We're managing," she said carefully. "We always manage." Managing, in her mouth, was not a heroic claim. It was an inventory of what had and not had been possible. She had a way of listing needs without inflating them, like someone who knew how to measure hunger in teaspoons. Augusto could have left it there, the exchange of civility complete. Instead, he set a bag of groceries on the threshold. Nothing elaborate, but enough to fill a pot and make a couple of solid meals. Rice, beans, a block of cheese, some fruit, milk. He did not thrust charity like a badge. He placed it gently, as if he were sliding a small raft towards someone treading water. Helena took the bag. Her hands moved with practiced economy. For a second, she seemed to imagine the future in which this act was a one-off event, lodged in memory, then buried. Then her eyes found his, and there was the briefest flash of something like gratitude, quick as a reflex and just as volatile. "You didn't have to," she said. "I know," Augusto answered, "but I wanted to." She let the words sit between them and did not parse them for implications. "We don't usually," she started, and then stopped. The unfinished thought was an admission. They did not usually take help from strangers. Pride had been a sort of armor. Accepting a stranger's help felt like unclasping a part of it. A child's laughter threaded through the stairwell. Ana Clara had appeared at the top step, hair in a disordered ponytail, cheeks flushed. She peeked around the door with the cautious hope of a child who had learned not to expect sustained miracles. When she saw the bag of food, her face softened, and she whispered a small, nearly imperceptible thanks. Augusto felt the air change. He had expected a simple transaction, Instead, he had stumbled into an exchange threaded with history and the fine-grained dignity of people who did not want the world to think them helpless. Before he left, he tucked a business card into Helena's hand, not as an emblem of power, but as a practical line of contact. He did not say he could change everything. He said he could help in ways he understood. There was a pause, a possible future vibrating in the silence. Helena held the card like something fragile. On the bus home, Augusto let his attention wander over decisions he had not meant to take. He had not set out to become involved. Yet involvement, once it begins, carries the peculiar elasticity of human connection. The more you pull, the more of yourself is drawn in. The doll, which had been a fleeting object in his briefcase, had become a hinge. He found himself tracing the arc backward to the moment when Ana Clara's small voice had hit that bakery bell and the day had pivoted. That night, he kept the doll on his desk, where it caught the lamplight and made its one good eye gleam. He found himself telling no one that he had gone to the family's building. His life was a set of polished surfaces, and he had learned over the years that personal curiosity rarely fit into a tidied schedule. Yet there was also a new restlessness. He realized as he sat in the quiet of his apartment that the groceries were not the end. Food could tide over a few meals, but it did not alter the architecture of a life lived on the knife edge of precariousness. The next morning, he saw the girl again at the bakery. Her movement was now easier, as if she had been given permission to breathe a little fuller. She waved at him, a quick, shy motion, and ran off. He watched her go, an odd tenderness assembling in his chest. He thought of children he had seen at charity galas, images sanitized, made palatable for donors, and of the distance between a nameless photo and the sticky reality of a small child who sold her possessions to feed a household. That afternoon, he drove through streets that led away from his usual routes. He parked by a row of storefronts with closed metal grates and walked, sometimes asking directions, sometimes listening in the way people do when they try to assemble another life from fragments. He asked about Helena, a woman's name in a neighborhood of 1,000 small lives. People pointed. He found himself in households that smelled of boiling water and old newspapers. A child kicked a tin can across a stoop. A woman peeled potatoes at the window. There was a rhythm to these places, the economy of small gestures that keep a life afloat. When he reached the tenement that housed Helena, a neighbor, a man with paint-stained hands, stopped him for a cigarette and said, "You got a good heart," the kind of thing people say when they want to make sense of someone else's surprising tenderness. Augusto smiled, but could not accept the compliment whole. He felt awkward with praise. It implied an identity he had not claimed for himself. If he had a heart, it was the kind that had been trained by routine and prudence, now being asked to learn a different grammar of obligation. He climbed the stairs and watched the door as though it might give him a clear sign. It did not. Life rarely gives clear signs. What it gives is messy, with edges that bruise. When Helena opened the door, she did it with the weary command of someone who had learned to protect a child by keeping her world narrow and manageable. Her eyes were quick and assessing. They measured him not for charity, but for threat. "Is Ana Clara with you?" he asked. "That's my daughter," Helena said. The words were compact, carrying the dual meanings of ownership and protectiveness. "I know," he replied. He hesitated. Then the honesty of a man who had felt guilt for the simplicity of his earlier action came out in an awkward line. "I couldn't stop thinking about the way you looked when she handed me the doll." Helena's face shifted, not into relief, but into a guarded curiosity. "Did you come to tell me you bought it?" he asked. "No," he said. "I came to see if there's more I can do. Not alms, not a show. Practical things. Work maybe. Stability. I know I'm asking a lot."
His voice was careful, as if putting something fragile on a table. Helena stared for a long moment. There were reasons to be skeptical of offers that sounded like lifelines. She had, in the past, encountered generosity that took forms more complicated than goods, favors that required too much, obligations that read like strings. Her life taught her to smell intentions the way a cook smells a stew, what is in it, what it will leave behind. "You know what people think," she said finally. "They see a suit and think he opens his front door to hand out clean money." "I don't want you to think that," Augusto said. "I'm willing to show up in ways that matter." Helena folded her arms. Her body language said what her words did not. Acceptance for her was not a default. It had to be earned. She took him in, measuring his patience, the steadiness in his voice, the modesty with which he offered himself. "You're welcome too," she started and stopped. The neighbor's cat wound itself around the threshold, indifferent to human scripts. Instead of pressing further, Augusto bought more groceries. He held nothing back for show. He bought ingredients and also small practical things. Soup packets, diapers for a neighbor's baby that had somehow become a shared burden, a small toy the child would not have to sell if tomorrow required it. He left the bags on the step with a sense that he had done something measurable and not merely performative. But as he walked away, the weight of the quiet between them felt like unfinished business. Back in his car, the doll made a small sound as it shifted against the briefcase. Augusto caught himself thinking of patterns, how one choice slipped into another, and how one day's noise could become the drumbeat for months to come. He had the impulse to tidy things into a neat solution. Hire Helena, pay her a fair wage, formalize the arrangement, make everything clean. But the neatness was tempting and naive. Work, Helena had taught him in the measured sentences of their conversation, was not simply a transaction, but a domain of identity. To offer a job was to offer a change of self, not just a monthly check. He spent the evening drafting possible approaches. In his head, he walked through onboarding steps, the practicalities of hiring someone quickly and decently, the paperwork, the training, the wage. He imagined Helena learning routines, moving through a workplace with a measured confidence. But alongside these logistical maps, there were human variables he could not model: shame, gossip, the small cruelty of colleagues who mistake humility for weakness. He felt accountable not only for the dollars he might provide, but for the environment that money would enter. The responsibility sat in him by pressure. 2 nights later, he found the doll's missing button on his desk, a tiny lost thing that had found its way into his life by accident. He sewed it back with a clumsy thread and felt a small, ridiculous satisfaction.
The act was symbolic, a repair of fabric and of impulse. Yet he knew that a sewn button did not repair the architecture of a family's insecurity. He slept with the thought that this would require a longer conjuring, an insistence that went beyond one-off acts. Helena did not call him. He did not expect her to. She had the good sense to wait. In the absence of contact, he returned to the neighborhood, more and more naturally, as if he had begun to claim a route that unfolded from his curiosity. People began to recognize him. The man in the suit was less a peculiar spectacle than a present fact. He learned the names of shopkeepers, the rhythm of the laundromat's machines. He started to understand small economies, how a week's worth of groceries could be a miracle, how a missed shift could tilt a family into hardship. On a humid Thursday, a neighbor told him, in a voice low with sympathy, that Anna Clara had missed a day of school because Helena had taken the little money they had to pay for a utility. "It's always something," the neighbor said, and the phrase meant an endless list of household acts compounding into constraint. Augusto felt the currency of urgency tighten. He tried to reason as a problem solver. Could he funnel enough assistance to close the immediate gaps? And then shook that off, aware of his own hubris. Money would help, so would jobs. But he could not simply parachute solutions over a life and expect a different skyline to stand. If he was to be involved, it would have to be sustained and respectful, an entrance that mattered where the people invited him into their dignity. He started to bring small things that suggested continuity rather than charity: a voucher for a local clinic where children could get immunizations, a referral to a community center that ran evening classes for adults learning basic computer skills. He began to speak to the bakers and the grocers he'd met, quietly asking if they could teach Helena a few practical skills in exchange for a modest wage. He learned the language of micro-relationships, favors exchanged not to buy gratitude, but to invite competence. Helena met these overtures with a mixture of suspicion and cautious pragmatism. She accepted the voucher for the clinic, but declined to let him speak with her neighbors about potential work. She guarded her agency like a thing you wrap tight. She would not be reduced to a beneficiary in need of constant rescue.
If she allowed a job, it would need to be on terms that preserved her self-respect. She had worked odd jobs before, cleaning houses, mending clothes, selling crafts at a small stand. The idea of working in a formal environment was both tempting and terrifying. It offered consistent pay and the possibility of something steadier. But it also carried the potential for humiliation, being late, being scolded, being watched by people who did not understand the compact of dignity she negotiated daily.
On a Saturday, she agreed to meet him halfway. She would come to the bakery, he would be there, and they would talk about practical things without dramatics. The meeting was short and honest. He proposed lessons instead of promises, help with resume-like papers, lessons in punctuality and customer service, a small stipend to cover training hours. She listened. She asked for time to think. The conversation had the rigorous economy of two people weighing long-term consequences. Stability could bruise pride. Pride could prevent stability. When Ana Clara arrived after school that day, she brought with her a new drawing, a sun again, but with a house beneath it now. She pressed it into his hand with the solemnity of someone who understood symbolic exchanges. "For you," she said, meeting for the man who had bought her doll. He felt the heat of embarrassment and gratitude mingled. He placed the drawing on his desk, where the doll sat like a small talisman, and a quiet promise swelled inside him. He would not close this loop too quickly. Yet the path forward was not linear. Rumors drifted through the neighborhood like thin smoke. At the bakery, someone muttered that the suit wanted something in return, or that he had motives beyond generosity. A coworker in his office said, innocuously and with a tone of curiosity, "You're spending a lot of time in that part of town. You trying out a new hobby?" Gossip always seeks to reduce complex passion to caricature. Augusto felt the sting, but also the relief of standing in the public eye with something honest. He kept his mouth shut when curiosities were offered. He allowed his actions to explain themselves. There were small setbacks. Helena missed a day when Ana Clara ran a fever. The cost of a clinic visit cut into their scarce funds. Augusto saw in that small medical slip how fragile a newly formed support could be. He arranged for someone at the clinic to see Ana Clara quickly, covering the copay without ceremony. He did not make an announcement. He did not publicize the favor. He treated the assistance as a thing that fixed an immediate problem and then required a plan to avoid recurrence. The line he envisioned was not charity for its own sake, but scaffolding, medical visits, a recipe for reliable wages, ways to guard against sudden setbacks. At the same time, spending time in the neighborhood, he began to see more of himself. In the mirror, the man who had walked with certainty now carried a new humility. He found himself listening more than instructing, learning the local rhythms and the names of children on the block, and noticing small signs of resilience. An elderly woman who folded clothes at 2 a.m, a teenage boy who forwarded packages for his neighbor, the way people shared coupons without asking for credit. He realized his role could not be that of a benevolent director. If there was to be a transformation that lasted, it would have to be co-authored.
One evening, when Ana Clara handed him a paper boat she had folded from an owed receipt, he felt the simplicity of connection. The boat slid across his palm, and he saw how an object could be both trivial and enormous. That night, he placed the doll on the dashboard of his car for a moment, as sunlight passed over them both. He thought about how peculiar it was for a man to be made responsible by a child's exchange. Responsibility, he realized, was not a word he had assigned to himself before that moment. It had arrived as a consequence of listening. There was, beneath everything, a tension he could not shake, the danger of becoming what he had always tried to avoid, a man who assumed he could fix people with money and schedules. That anxiety kept him from grand gestures. He wanted to be useful, not theatrical. He found ways to hide his unease in practicalities, a schedule for borrowed tools, the arrangement of a small training session at one of his businesses where Helena could learn basic skills without the glare of condescension. When he first proposed the idea to one of his managers, carefully in a quiet corridor, as if it were merely a thought experiment, he was met with the predictable skepticism of someone whose life had been organized about hierarchy. "You sure about this?" the manager asked. "Hiring someone off the street is complex." Augusto did not deny complexity. "I'm aware," he said, "but complexity is not a reason to avoid doing the right thing. It's a reason to plan for it." He arranged the meeting not as a savior, but as an employer who believed in structured support. He drafted a modest proposal: part-time work, supervised training, a mentor assigned from a pool of patient, willing employees. He thought of Helena's pride and wanted to preserve it, not erode it under the weight of charity masquerading as employment.
There would be probationary periods, clear expectations, respect for dignity. He wanted her to be a part of something that welcomed competence and offered security. That proposal was the hinge that would, later, swing the story into new territory. But for now, the hinge moved slowly, squeezing between hesitancy and hope. Helena listened when he described the plan, measuring each sentence like a currency with hidden fees. Her body was still guarded, but the line of possibility had stretched. She asked practical questions, about hours, about childcare, about transportation. He answered with a patience he had not known he possessed. When the first informal trial day arrived, an afternoon shadowed with uncertainty, Helena stood at the threshold of the workplace like someone about to cross a cultural divide. She had dressed simply but cleanly, hair tied back with a string. Augusto watched from a distance as she navigated the first interactions, the receptionist who explained the sign-in process, the trainer who offered a warm, uncomplicated smile. Small kindnesses shifted the atmosphere.
A colleague showed Helena where the restroom was, without dramatizing her presence. The details mattered. They did not make headlines, but they stitched routine into a new fabric. Still, there were micro-conflicts, a whisper that seemed louder than it should be, a brow raised at a missed step, the inevitable clumsiness of learning. Helena felt each one as a test of belonging. She steadied herself, and with a slow accumulation of competence, she began to move through the space with less fear. Augusto watched the horizon of her confidence expand in millimeters, like the slow rate at which a plant pushes toward light. It was, in those early days, a mutual learning. Helena learned that a workplace could be a place of dignity. Augusto learned that committing to help meant accepting the discomfort of vulnerability. He had expected his intervention to be a small moral corrective. Instead, it demanded a restructuring in how he organized his time and attention. He found himself attending meetings with one eye on the calendar and another on the week's schedule that would allow him to check in with Helena discreetly. Responsibility, once taken, curdled into the everyday. He had not saved anyone in a heroic sweep. No sudden transformation had occurred. What had happened, quietly, was that two lives began to weave into a shared fabric of mutual obligation and respect. Helena found in the job a rhythm that steadied her days. Anna Clara kept her doll in a safe place and began to go to school more often. The doll, threadbare and button-eyed, became a small emblem of the possibilities that pass through the hands of people who are willing to notice. For Augusto, it became a talisman of his own evolving conscience. He would keep it near to remind himself of the precariousness that walked in the world alongside his routines. But for all these small victories, there were tests ahead. Rumors would gather, pride would test loyalty, emergencies would surface that money alone could not fix, and a question would sit at the hinge of every decision. How do you help without taking away what dignity remains? He had not yet reached the moment when he would formalize anything, when a paper envelope would make the promise official. That culmination lay in the future, a future that had to be earned. For now, there were meetings, small adjustments, the slow work of trust. He kept the doll in his briefcase like a loose promise, sewn button peeking out like a compass. The city moved around him, indifferent and intimate by turns, and Augusto found that he could no longer slide past the people who lived at the edge of his life without leaving a hand outstretched. That afternoon, as he stood again at the threshold of Helena's door, he noticed a neighbor sweeping and a child humming behind them. Inside, the light caught on a pot of soup simmering on the stove. Anna Clara leaned against the doorway, watching him with the kind of expectancy a child reserves for the rare, non-routine.
For a moment, everything held its breath. The ordinary world balanced on the thinness of a decision. Augusto walked in, set his briefcase down, and reached into it. He pulled out the doll and handed it to Anna Clara without fanfare. "I thought it belonged with her," he said. Her face lit in a small, contained way. She hugged it like you hug the idea of safety, like the doll had the power to stitch a fragment of childhood back together. Helena watched, and in that watching something shifted. She invited him in, finally, to sit at the battered kitchen table. They ate the soup together in a silence that was neither awkward nor facile, a silence filled with the work of two people choosing the normalcy of a shared meal. When he left, the evening air had cooled. He walked down the stairs thinking of what would come next. He felt the tug of responsibility more keenly than he had thought possible. The pattern of a life can be altered by the smallest hinge. A voice at a bakery,
A bill handed over without calculation. A doll placed in a briefcase and then handed back again. It was not the act itself that changed the world, but the choices that followed, the ones that asked for time, patience, and a willingness to let one's days be rearranged by another person's dignity. He kept walking, the city's lights folding into the distance, and the doll's small fabric weight was a steady reminder in his mind that some encounters demand more than a single compassionate moment. They ask for commitment. They ask for a willingness to be changed. Days folded into weeks, and the change arrived in increments small enough to mistake for ordinary life. Helena's schedule began to anchor itself around a set of shifts, the kind of mundane predictability that has the power to steady a household. 2 mornings at the bakery, 3 afternoons at a distribution point one of Augusta's businesses operated for local suppliers. She learned to set an alarm and to trust the tiny ritual of the commute. Ana Clara, freed from the barter of playthings, found more room to be a child, homework that was not negotiated into a meal, afternoons when she could linger at the doorway and watch the street. For Augusta, the work of commitment revealed its own particular demands. He rearranged calendars, redistributed responsibilities, and found, with some embarrassment, that he had to refuse certain meetings to keep a promise he had made by sitting quietly at a chipped kitchen table and eating soup. The act of being reliable became less about grand speeches and more about doing the boring things well, clearing a human resources path for a hire, signing off on training budgets, and sometimes simply reading an email from Helena that said, "I'm running late," and then making a note to adjust a pickup time. Helena's first formal paycheck, small, straightforward, and calculated precisely to cover training hours and basic expenses, arrived like an answer to a question she had been asking herself for years.
It did not fix every problem. It did not erase the nights when a leaky faucet would become a reason to choose between a plumber and an extra week of groceries. But it changed the ledger of dignity. She counted the money not as a favor, but as labor, and that arithmetic shifted something inside her. Work offered her a place in the world that required skill and returned compensation. That exchange, plain and unadorned, was its own kind of salvation. At the bakery and at the distribution office, she met people who would test her resilience. There were colleagues who were open-handed and others whose curiosity hardened into whispering. Rumor, operating in human time, can flatten complex motives into neat accusations. "He's got a hobby," one person quipped, meaning he had time to shepherd the neighborhood. Another offered, "That job will sort itself out," meaning perhaps that a precarious arrangement would collapse. Helena learned to swim against these currents. She focused on the tasks at hand, measuring dough, labeling boxes, answering a phone with a steady hello. And in doing so, she began to build a track record that could not be easily reduced to gossip. One morning, during a busy hour, a mistake occurred. A delivery labeled for a nearby school was misrouted, and a teacher called irate, demanding an answer. Helena, on the register, had signed the wrong paperwork in a moment of fluster. The error was small by some measures, costly by others. Heads turned, fingers found whispering positions near the counter. Helena felt the old, familiar heat of shame begin to gather in her chest. It is a particular thing to feel the years of scrambling compress into a single mistake, and to hear it framed as proof rather than evidence. She stepped out from behind the counter, because hiding is not how problems are solved. She took responsibility, called the supplier, arranged for the corrected delivery, and stayed behind after hours to help reconcile invoices. Her actions were steady, uncompensated by fanfare, but they mattered. A supervisor, a woman named Patricia, caught the movement and, with quiet bluntness, told anyone who listened. She fixed what she could, and she owned the rest. The whisper network, when it encountered the weight of competence, shifted. Not everyone changed their view overnight, but a mistake that once would have been a verdict became instead a test she passed. Augusto watched these small battles with a mix of pride and unease. His role had been to open a door and then step back enough to let Helena walk through it on her own feet. There were times he failed at that restraint. He found himself approving minor expenditures without consulting the team, or arriving unannounced to check how training was unfolding. Each intrusion risked the very dignity he sought to preserve.
So he learned, often awkwardly, to be a facilitator rather than a director. He negotiated childcare stipends quietly through payroll. He arranged for a trusted training mentor. Patricia herself agreed to take the role. And he insisted, privately, that the workplace treat this as a normal hire, not a charity case. That insistence mattered. Policies, even small ones, provide scaffolding for people who are building new habits, and Helena needed more than good intentions. She needed a system that treated her fairly. The neighborhood watched the daily movements with the patient calibration of people who have seen many attempts at change. Some neighbors were glad. Murmurs of approval circulated. Others remained skeptical, waiting for the arrangement to fray. For their part, Helena and Ana Clara navigated this new visibility with a kind of exhausted caution. Helena would not allow pity to become her story. She insisted on being seen as an employee, a mother, and a neighbor. She took part in staff meetings, answered questions about availability, and slowly, people learned to address her not as the woman from the block, but by name. The tests continued. Somewhere between the small victories and the routines, a crisis arrived, not of money, but of time. Ana Clara came home with a rash and a fever one humid afternoon, high enough to wrinkle any plan. The clinic Helena had a voucher for could help, and Augusto, who had learned to move without making a show of it, arranged the appointment, told the HR department to extend paid sick leave if necessary, and then quietly went to fetch a neighbor who could watch the child while Helena tended to the paperwork at the clinic. The real thing that mattered in moments like these was not the individual payment or the clinic visit, it was the choreography of people who had chosen to be available when life skidded. Helena, exhausted and furious with herself for past miscalculations, realized in the clinic waiting room that what had once been a chain of solitary struggles had for the first time in a long while a loose but present network. She did not need to put on an armor of independence so heavy that it cracked her shoulders. She could accept help that came without strings. The relief was not immediate, but it was steadying. The following week, when anecdote caught up with practice and the child was well again, Helena showed up to work and did her shift. The day hummed like a machine returning to balance. Alongside these intimate shifts, Augusto found his own inner topography changing. Where once his sense of accomplishment had been measured in deals closed and spreadsheets balanced, he began to take stock in different metrics. The number of nights Ana Clara slept through without worrying, the way Helena's laugh found its old edges at dinner, the small, almost comical pride he felt when a neighbor congratulated him less for his money than for being reliably present.
He started saying no to an expensive fundraiser because the time it required would pull him away from a training session he had promised to attend. To his old colleagues, these choices looked odd. To him, they were consequences he had to accept. There was also a quieter transformation under the skin. He had always kept a set of little rituals, coffee in the morning, emails before a certain hour, but those were now spliced with new ones. An evening check-in message to Helena, a brief weekly meeting with Patricia to review progress, the habit of sewing on a loose button when he found it. The doll, which had been returned to Ana Clara, continued to be a ledger in his mind. He had given it back. It had been given back to him, again and again, in the form of responsibility. Months passed, and the slow accumulation of proof made formalization not a spectacle, but a necessity. The company's HR department, guided by Patricia and with Augusto's quiet insistence, drew up a contract. It was practical and modest, a regular part-time position with guaranteed hours, paid holidays, and a benefits package that included medical coverage for minors and a small emergency fund administered with confidentiality. The envelope that contained the contract was simple, unostentatious, the sort they pass across desks with the authority of paperwork rather than sentiment. When Augusto arrived at Helena's door to hand over the envelope, the moment was not theatrical. He sat at the same battered kitchen table where they had shared soup months earlier. The gravity of the ordinary held its ground, steam rising from a mug, a radio murmuring in the next room, a child's crayon drawings taped to the wall. Ana Clara, older now in ways only a child can be, less likely to sell what she loved, watched from the doorway. "This is documentation of a job," Augusto said, and he watched the muscles in Helena's face as she read. She scanned the lines, the hours, the rate, the clause about paid sick leave, then looked up. For a long moment her eyes searched his, as if witnessing the promise in ink. She asked one practical question about payroll dates. He answered. The ordinary rose up in full force, the mundane needs, the dull gold of regularity. When Helena signed the form, her handwriting was steady. It was not a scene of triumph. It was a recording of a mutual agreement, simple and binding. She did not collapse into tears. She did not make a speech. She folded the paper and placed it into an envelope of her own,
then tucked the envelope into her apron pocket with the same careful economy she used for all valuable things. The action was private but profound. After the signatures, Ana Clara surprised everyone in the smallest way. She walked up to Augusto with the doll clutched against her chest. The toy had been mended, a button sewn on, an inch of loose seam tightened with the earnestness of a child's attempt. She did not speak at first.
Then, in a voice barely above breath, she said, "I wanted you to remember." Her meaning was simple and full. The doll was a talisman of the thread that now tied them together. She pressed it into his hand as if offering a compact of trust. Augusto felt the weight of that gesture in his bones. He had not expected to be entrusted with a child's relic. He took the doll with both reverence and embarrassment. "I will keep it," he said. "Not to own it, but to remember what I have to do." It was an honest confession of accountability, more than a ceremony of thanks. In the months that followed, the contract did its quiet work. Helena's paycheck arrived on schedule. She began to save small amounts for things she had nearly stopped allowing herself to imagine: a pair of shoes that would last a season, a dental visit for Ana Clara, a small fan for the bedroom that churned hot nights into manageable ones. Her neighbors began to greet her with the sort of acknowledgement that recognizes competence: a nod from the grocer, a corrected recipe from a woman who had worked the same stove for decades. She was not suddenly immune to hardship. Emergencies still demanded creativity, but the tilt toward possibility had become measurable. Workplace culture continued to be a terrain Helena navigated with care. There were moments when colleagues forgot the complexity of her life and made offhand comments that stung. There were supervisors who asked for extra deliveries at the last minute, assuming her availability. In these moments, the scaffolding Augusto had helped establish mattered. Patricia, who had become more than a manager, a mentor, intervened when needed, ensuring that requests were reasonable and that Helena had recourse when a deadline was unfair. Small protections mattered because dignity is often defended in those quiet bureaucratic details. Augusto kept learning a different vocabulary of humility. His friends in high finance remarked, with a mix of teasing and curiosity, that he had become the man who got a job done in the neighborhood. He laughed when they said it, sometimes, but he was also aware of the transformation inside him. He had traded the clean triumph of a closed deal for the messy, incomplete satisfaction of being present in a way that could be sustained. It was, in an odd way, more demanding. There were times when Helena almost gave up. A rumor at work once escalated beyond the superficial and reached payroll in the form of a bureaucratic hiccup. An administrative error threatened to withhold the benefits that had been promised. The inconvenience might have been fixed with a memo, but for a week Helena and Augusto watched the shadow of uncertainty creep across the useful stability they had built. Helena felt the old panic: how easily a small administrative mistake can unmoor a sense of security. This time, however, the system had an advocate.
Augusto intervened privately, not to sweep things aside, but to insist that the process be corrected and assurances be made public. The benefits were restored. Helena's relief was not dramatic. It was a sensible, deep breath that allowed her to sleep that night. Through all of this, the neighborhood began to perceive the relationship less as spectacle and more as a new fact of life. Children learned that Ana Clara's mother worked scheduled hours. Shopkeepers adjusted lines of credit slightly, knowing they were backed by a regular deposit. People told stories in the way neighborhoods do, not headlines, but anecdotes passed over fences and shop counters. Some tales were kind, others remained skeptical, but the balance tipped toward a new normal. For Augusto, the most personal change was not external. He found himself more attentive to the small domestic details of his own life, as if a lens had been turned inward. He began to notice the employees at his own firm, not as instruments of quarterly goals, but as people whose lives were entangled with schedules and children and small habits. He started hosting occasional low-key lunches where employees could raise issues without the polished dissociation of a boardroom. The doll remained a private reminder, sometimes nestled in his briefcase, sometimes on his desk, a little emblem of a life he had been asked to respect. The story did not end with a single moment of recognition. There were no broad proclamations. The climax, if it can be called that, arrived in a scene of modest celebration, a small gathering outside the bakery on a late summer evening. Neighbors brought something to share: a plate of pastries, a jar of beans, a pot of soup. Helena wore the uniform of her workplace, a practical apron that marked her as a participant in the city's daily life. Ana Clara ran among the legs and chairs, a ribbon in her hair.
Augusto, who had learned to carry his emotions with quiet modesty, looked on with the odd vulnerability of someone who feels gratitude that feels like an added responsibility. Patricia gave a brief, unspectacular word of acknowledgement about Helena's steady work. A few people clapped, and then everyone returned to conversation. The applause was not for a hero. It was, more simply, for one woman who had shown competence under pressure. That was the kind of recognition that mattered. After the crowd thinned, Helena pulled Augusto aside. "Thank you," she said. The words felt insufficient to carry the full measure of her life, but they were offered without theatricality. "We're finding our way," she added, and there was no false sentiment in the sentence. It was a report, a pragmatic statement about ongoing work. Augusto kept the doll in a small pocket in his briefcase for a long time after that night, a tactile reminder of the month he had promised to keep. Occasionally he would take it out and find his thumb tracing the sewn button, a tiny ritual of humility.
He had the impulse, less and less urgent, to give speeches about responsibility. Instead, he learned to let actions accumulate into habit. An emergency fund that handled unexpected clinic bills, a quiet line of communication with Patricia, a weekly check-in that respected Helena's privacy while ensuring she had what she needed to succeed. When Anacleta left a new drawing one morning, this time a sun perched above a small house with a door slightly ajar, Augusto pinned it to a board in his office where he kept small reminders of why he had started. The drawing was not a trophy. It was evidence of a child who had been allowed to keep her childhood, of a family that had found a thread of stability, of a man who had been changed by proximity rather than by grand gestures. Looking back, the sequence of events seemed less like a single act of charity and more like a mosaic of choices. The initial purchase of the doll had been the hinge, yes, but it was the follow-through, the insistence on paperwork, on dignity, on predictable pay, on quiet interventions that gave the narrative its shape. No one was saved in the fairy tale sense. There were setbacks and days when the margin was thin, but there was also a steady, real improvement in the arithmetic of daily life. Augusto sometimes thought about how odd it was that a child's small plea had rearranged his priorities. The city still moved with the same indifferent rhythm, traffic, construction, the cold calculation of markets. Yet within that vast, unfeeling machine, a small human fact had altered the course of a few lives. The doll remained a compass, a small cloth object that pointed back to a moment of ethical decision. In private, he would touch that button and remember the specificity of helplessness and choice. He understood now that wealth carried not simply the capacity to give, but the obligation to design giving in ways that preserved dignity. He also understood that those who receive help must be treated as partners in the work of transformation, not as passive recipients waiting for an intervention. The respect with which an offer is made matters as much as the offer itself. The final scenes of this slow transformation were prosaic and beautiful in their ordinariness. Helena tucking Anacleta into bed with a story that was not always interrupted by worry. A crisp paycheck that arrived on schedule and was met not with spectacle, but with a sense of order. A neighbor borrowing and returning a tool without fanfare. Augusto kept the doll in a small compartment of his briefcase for years after, not because it had been the most valuable thing, but because it was a reminder that responsibility often looks like a pocket-sized object you can carry with you, a steady weight that reorients the day. One late afternoon, years on, he found himself in the bakery again. The air was the familiar mix of yeast and sugar, but the people leaned in different ways now. Older kids who had once learned to fold napkins, a new barista who had been there when Helena's daughter took a baking class. Ana Clara, taller and with less of the hurriedness that characterized her earliest years, waved and ran between tables. Helena emerged from the kitchen, and the two of them exchanged a glance that carried the residue of weathered days. Augusta caught that glance and felt something like completion without finality. There was no neat ending, because life is rarely so tidy. Instead, there was a continuation, an ongoing work of listening, planning, and showing up. He reached into his briefcase and, almost by reflex, smoothed the doll's fabric. The button he had sewn years ago still held. He smiled at the smallness of the gesture and at the vastness of its implications. Have you ever been changed by a small act of kindness? Tell us below.